Story 1. The Night Visitor. I've lived in my current apartment for about 3 years now. It's a small 2-bedroom unit in a quiet complex in suburban Arizona. When I first moved in, I was 24 and fresh out of grad school, starting my first real job as a software developer. The rent was affordable, and the location was perfect, close to work and in a safe neighborhood. For the first year or so, I barely interacted with my neighbors. I'm not antisocial, but I work long hours and usually just keep to myself. The apartment directly above mine was occupied by a woman who seemed to be in her late 50s. I'd occasionally see her in the parking lot or at the mailboxes, and we'd exchange polite nods but never really talked. Things started getting weird around the end of my second year living there. I began noticing that whenever I'd come home from work, usually around 7 p.m., I'd see her curtains move in the window above, like she was watching for me to arrive. At first I thought maybe it was just coincidence, but it happened so consistently that I couldn't ignore it anymore. Then the notes started appearing. I'd find small pieces of paper tucked under my door or in my mailbox. They were handwritten messages, always about mundane things. The first one said, "You left your porch light on all night." Another said, "Your car alarm went off at 3 a.m. last Tuesday." The messages weren't threatening, but they made it clear that she was paying very close attention to my daily routine. I tried to brush it off as her just being an overly observant neighbor, maybe lonely and looking for connection. But then things escalated. One night around 11 p.m., I was getting ready for bed when I heard footsteps above me. This wasn't unusual. I could often hear her walking around her apartment. But these footsteps were different. They moved slowly across her floor, stopped right above where I was standing in my bedroom, and stayed there. Complete stillness for maybe 30 seconds. Then the footsteps moved to another spot where I'd moved to, and stopped again. It was like she was tracking my movements from above, following me room to room. This happened several more times over the following weeks. I started to feel uncomfortable in my own apartment, especially at night. I'd find myself walking on tiptoes, trying not to make noise, which was ridiculous. I had every right to move around my own place. One Saturday morning, I was making breakfast when I heard a loud bang from above, followed by what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor. Then silence. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock at my door. I looked through the peephole and saw my upstairs neighbor standing there. She was wearing a bathrobe and had this strange, intense expression on her face. I opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Can I help you?" I asked. She stared at me for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said, "I need to come inside your apartment." "Excuse me?" "I need to see your ceiling. Something's wrong with my floor, and I need to check your ceiling to see if there's damage." I told her she should contact the property manager about maintenance issues. She insisted she needed to see it right now. Her tone was getting more agitated. I said no, closed the door, and immediately called the property manager to report the interaction. They said they'd make a note of it, but there wasn't much they could do unless she was directly threatening me. That night I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound that made my blood run cold. Someone was trying to unlock my door. I could hear a key sliding into the lock, turning but not quite working because I'd engaged the deadbolt from inside. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door as quietly as possible. Through the peephole I could see her, my upstairs neighbor, standing in the hallway in her bathrobe, holding a set of keys and trying different ones in my lock. I called 911 immediately. The dispatcher stayed on the line with me while police were sent. Within about 8 minutes, I could see flashing lights through my window. I heard voices in the hallway, and when I looked through the peephole again, 2 police officers were talking to my neighbor. I opened the door and explained what had happened. The woman claimed she'd gotten confused and thought my apartment was hers, even though her unit number was clearly different and on a different floor. The officers didn't seem to buy it, but said since she hadn't actually entered my apartment, there wasn't much they could charge her with. They did, however, strongly suggest she see someone about her confusion and warned her to stay away from my apartment. The property manager was notified and said they'd monitor the situation. For about a week, things were quiet. Then I started noticing items missing from outside my door. A doormat, a package, a plant I'd put out on my small patio area. Nothing valuable, but things that were clearly mine. The final straw came 2 weeks after the door incident. I woke up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom. As I was walking back to my bedroom, I glanced toward my living room window and froze. There was a face pressed against the glass, staring in at me. My apartment is on the 2nd floor. Someone had climbed onto my patio balcony and was looking into my apartment. I immediately recognized her, my upstairs neighbor. We made eye contact for what felt like an eternity. Then she slowly backed away, and I heard her climbing back up to her own balcony above mine. I called the police again. This time they took it more seriously because she'd actually trespassed onto my property. They went to her apartment and found that she'd been using a rope to lower herself from her balcony to mine. She was ultimately arrested for trespassing and criminal stalking. During the investigation, police found multiple photos of me that she'd taken from her window, along with detailed notes about my daily schedule. What time I left for work, what time I came home when I had visitors, everything. The property manager finally evicted her. I found out later that she'd had similar incidents at previous residences. Apparently, she would fixate on neighbors, usually younger people living alone, and would escalate her behavior over time until she was forced to move. I lived in that apartment for another 6 months, but never felt comfortable there again. Every sound above me made me jump. I eventually broke my lease and moved to a top-floor unit in a different complex. I made sure to choose a place where I'd have no one above me and where the balcony couldn't be accessed from other units. This happened when I was in high school, living with my parents and younger sister in a suburban neighborhood in Oregon. We'd lived in the house for about 5 years at that point, and we knew most of our neighbors pretty well. It was that kind of neighborhood where people would wave to each other, have block parties, and generally look out for one another, except for the house directly behind ours. Our properties backed up to each other, separated only by a wooden fence about 6 feet high. The house behind us had been empty for the first 4 years we lived there. It was owned by some kind of investment company and had been used as a rental, but it sat vacant for a long time. Then, in my junior year, new people moved in, a couple in their 40s and what appeared to be the man's elderly father. We never formally met them. They kept to themselves and didn't participate in any neighborhood activities. The first indication that something was off came about a month after they moved in. My dad noticed that our back fence had been damaged. Several boards were loose, like someone had been trying to pry them apart from the other side. He reinforced them and didn't think much more about it. Then our dog started acting strange. We had a golden retriever named Bailey, who was usually friendly and calm, but she started refusing to go into our backyard. She'd plant her feet at the door and whine, and if we forced her outside, she'd immediately run back to the door and scratch to get back in. My dad thought maybe she'd had a bad encounter with a raccoon or something and would get over it. But her behavior got worse. She'd bark at the back fence at all hours, especially at night. One evening, I was in my room doing homework when Bailey started barking frantically in the backyard. I looked out my window, which had a view of both our yard and part of the neighbor's yard behind us. What I saw made me freeze. The elderly man from the house behind us was standing at the fence, on his side, with his face pressed between 2 of the boards, staring into our yard. Not just looking, staring with this intense, unblinking focus. Bailey was going crazy, barking right at where he was standing. He didn't move or react to the dog at all, just kept staring into our yard. I called my dad and we both watched from the window. After about 5 minutes, the man finally backed away and went into his house. My dad went out to check the fence and found that several boards had been loosened again, creating gaps wide enough for someone to see through clearly. My dad went over to talk to the neighbors the next day. The younger man answered the door and was defensive when my dad brought up the fence situation. He said his father had dementia and sometimes wandered around confused. My dad said he understood, but asked if they could make sure the old man stayed inside, especially at night. The situation seemed resolved until about a week later. I was letting Bailey out in the backyard before bed. She'd finally started going out again, though she was still nervous. I watched from the door as she did her business. That's when I saw movement along the fence line. The elderly man was there again, but this time he was doing something I couldn't quite make out. I turned on the back porch light and saw that he was reaching through one of the gaps in the fence, trying to grab at Bailey. I ran out and grabbed my dog, bringing her inside. I could still see the old man's arm reaching through the fence, his fingers grasping at air. My dad came out and shouted at the man to go back inside. The arm slowly withdrew, and we saw the man shuffle away. This time my dad called the police. When they arrived, they spoke with the neighbors, and the situation was explained again. Dementia, wandering, very sorry, they'd watch him more carefully. But it kept happening. At least once a week we'd catch the old man at the fence, either staring through or reaching through. My parents considered building a higher fence or putting up some kind of barrier, but before they could make a decision, something happened that changed everything. It was a Saturday morning. My sister and I were supposed to go to the mall with friends, but our ride was running late, so we decided to wait in the backyard. It was a nice day, and we were just sitting on the deck talking. That's when we heard a voice from the other side of the fence, a low, whispering voice that was hard to make out. We both went quiet and listened. "Come here," the voice said. "Come closer to the fence." We didn't recognize the voice, but we had a pretty good idea who it was. We stayed where we were, not saying anything. "I can see you," the voice continued. "Come closer. I have something to show you." My sister grabbed my arm. We were both scared now. I pulled out my phone and texted my dad, who was inside, telling him the neighbor was talking to us over the fence. "Don't be afraid," the voice said, now sounding more agitated. "Just come here. Come look." That's when we heard my dad's voice boom from the back door. "Get away from that fence right now or I'm calling the police." There was silence for a moment. Then we heard shuffling sounds and a door slamming. My dad came out and we told him everything. He called the police immediately. When the officers arrived and spoke with the neighbors, they found that the elderly man had actually removed several fence boards on his side and had been regularly entering our yard at night. They found muddy footprints leading from the fence to various areas of our yard, including right up to our back door. The neighbors were given a formal warning and told to secure their father or face more serious consequences. The younger couple seemed genuinely distressed and claimed they had no idea he'd been removing the fence boards. My dad installed security cameras and motion sensor lights in the backyard. The cameras caught the old man 3 more times trying to come through the fence, despite his family's promises to watch him. Finally, about a month later, an ambulance and police cars showed up at the neighbor's house. We learned later that the old man had become increasingly aggressive and unstable, and his family had finally agreed to place him in a supervised care facility. The younger couple moved out shortly after that, and the house went back on the market. I think the whole situation had been too much for them to handle. We lived there for another 2 years before I went away to college. My dad replaced that entire section of fence with something much more secure, and Bailey eventually went back to being her normal, friendly self. But I'll never forget the feeling of being watched from behind that fence, or the sound of that whispering voice trying to lure us closer. I'm 28 now, and this happened about 4 years ago when I was living in my first apartment after college. It was a small studio in a converted house in a college town in Massachusetts. The house had been split into 4 separate units, 2 on the first floor and 2 on the second. I had one of the upstairs units. The unit next to mine was occupied by a guy I'll call Derek. He was probably in his mid-30s, worked some kind of night shift job, and generally kept weird hours. I'd hear him coming and going at strange times, but he was quiet and we had very minimal interaction, just occasional nods in passing. The walls between our units were thin. I could often hear him moving around, playing music, talking on the phone. It didn't really bother me. That's just what you deal with in cheap apartments. I'm sure he could hear me too. One night I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, getting ready to sleep. It was around midnight. I heard Derek come home, the sound of his door opening and closing, footsteps in his apartment. Normal stuff. Then I heard something that made me pause. It sounded like he was playing a recording of a conversation. I could hear voices, his voice and another voice. They were talking about normal stuff, nothing remarkable, but something about it felt off. Then I realized what was wrong. The other voice I was hearing, it was my voice. I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. I listened more carefully. He was definitely playing a recording of a conversation, and one of the voices was unmistakably mine. I recognized the words. I was talking about my day at work, mentioning my co-worker Sarah by name, talking about a project deadline. It was a conversation I'd had on my phone earlier that day, in my apartment, talking to my best friend from college. My stomach dropped. He'd somehow recorded my phone conversation through the wall. I didn't know what to do. I sat there in the dark, listening as he played the recording multiple times. He'd pause it, rewind it, play sections over again, like he was studying it. After about 30 minutes, the sounds from his apartment stopped. I couldn't sleep. I lay there thinking about what I'd heard and trying to figure out what to do about it. The next day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, came home, but I was hyper-aware of everything I said in my apartment. I found myself speaking more quietly on phone calls, and I started playing music whenever I had conversations just to mask my voice. A few days later, it happened again. I heard him playing another recording. This time it was a conversation I'd had with my mom on the phone just the day before. I'd been talking about potentially moving to a new apartment because my lease was coming up for renewal. That's when I started to feel genuinely scared. He wasn't just accidentally overhearing me, he was actively recording my conversations and playing them back, apparently listening to them multiple times. I decided I needed to do something. I called the non-emergency police line and explained the situation. They said that recording someone without their knowledge in their own home could be illegal depending on the state and circumstances, but they'd need more proof than just me hearing what sounded like my own voice through the wall. They suggested I try to make a recording of him playing back my recordings, essentially evidence of evidence. It sounded complicated, but I agreed to try. Over the next week, I kept my phone's voice recorder running whenever I was in my apartment. On day 4, I caught it. I was home on a Saturday afternoon when I heard him start playing recordings again. I grabbed my phone and recorded about 10 minutes of him playing back various recordings of my conversations. You could clearly hear my voice talking about personal things, plans I'd made, phone calls with friends, even me talking to myself while doing chores around the apartment. I took this recording to the police. This time, they took it more seriously. They spoke with my landlord and requested access to Derek's apartment. I don't know exactly what happened during that interaction, but later that day I saw Derek being escorted out of the building by police officers. My landlord called me that evening. He said they'd found extensive recording equipment in Derek's apartment, multiple devices positioned against the shared wall between our units, all actively recording. They'd also found hours and hours of saved recordings on his computer, not just of me, but apparently of previous tenants who'd lived in my unit before I moved in. Derek was charged with illegal surveillance and violation of privacy. The landlord offered to let me break my lease without penalty if I wanted to move out, which I immediately accepted. I found out later, through a news article about the case, that Derek had been doing this for years. He'd been evicted from multiple apartments for similar behavior. He'd apparently become obsessed with listening to and studying his neighbors' private conversations. The psychological evaluation done during his case suggested it was some kind of compulsive behavior related to social anxiety and obsessive tendencies. He eventually pleaded guilty to various charges and was sentenced to probation, mandatory psychiatric treatment, and was prohibited from living in multi-unit housing without disclosure of his conviction to landlords and neighbors. I moved to a different apartment in a building with much thicker walls. Even now, years later, I'm careful about what I say in my home. I often wonder how many of my private conversations, thoughts, and personal moments he heard and recorded. It's a violation that still makes me uncomfortable to think about. The whole experience taught me that privacy is something we often take for granted, and that sometimes the people living just feet away from us can be observing and recording our lives in ways we never imagined.